All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our weekly interview and performance series. This has been a long time in the making. Today we have the wonderful pianist, a composer, and educator, head of the jazz department at Pacific Lutheran University. This is the wonderful Cassio Vianna. Cassio, thank you
Hey,
for joining us.
thank you, Kareem. Such a pleasure to be here with you. I really wanted to do this for a long
Yes.
time. Chat with you.
Yeah, I know. As musicians, and we've talked about this before, a lot of times we get wrapped into our bubble of like, you have to do a million jobs now. You have to teach, you have to play, you have to write, you have to, and if you have a family, it's 10 million more things to do. So it's hard to get together and hang. And since we've been doing this series, there's musicians that I've known for like, 20, 30 years that we've had conversations and I've learned stuff that I've never knew before. So it's a pleasure to be able to do this today. I'm glad you could be here.
Great, really happy to be here.
So before we start, as per usual, I always forget to mention this stuff, but if you have any questions for myself or Cassio about anything that we're talking about, feel free to put your questions in the comments. You can do this live during the interview or even after the fact, and we'll be happy to get to them. And of course, thank you to our sponsors, Ted Brown Music, KNKX, Tacoma Creates, Edward Jones Financial Consultant, Rick Gray, and Titusville Cars. And for all of you guys that come out to the shows and watch this stuff and make donations and support the work that we're doing, we appreciate it. And as I mentioned before, the majority of our work throughout the entire year is 100% free in all ages. So it's very important to us to keep it that way because art is for everybody. So Cassio, for those of you that don't already know you here in the Northwest, you've been here for a while. You told me you arrived right before the pandemic, which is not the greatest. But can you talk how you grew up in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, correct? Can you talk about where you grew up and how music became part of your life?
Okay, do you have a lot of time for that?
We have an hour. Go.
So yeah, I was born in Rio de Janeiro, in the suburb of Rio de Janeiro. Um, Music came to my life in a weird way, and it's funny. I'm getting to that age where thinking I'm getting old. That's what I'm saying. And we think, wow, how did it happen that I got here and that I do what I do? Uh, my my life in music started at church. So my mom got to a church, and then there were no musicians there, and there was just the two of us. And then she decided there was an organ that no one used, and then she decided to learn. She was in her 30s, and I was 8. uh, and then she started taking lessons, but like I would go with her because I didn't want to stay home by myself at the time. And then of the lesson, and then she jokes that I came back home. She would come back home and practice. I would correct her and say, "No, finger three." The teacher said finger three. Anyway, she said, "Well, you want to learn too?" So I decided to learn too. So it's about 8.5, and then we switched. So I started playing at church when I was basically 9 years old. And that was a very interesting thing because from that time, I started learning, officially learning classical piano. And then still in the church, because the church has this, flexible musical spectrum in which you play traditional hymns, but you also play some sort of semi-classical arrangements. But also, you always have a bunch of young people wanting to play chords and contemporary. So that was really my beginning in music before I got into like learning Brazilian jazz. So growing up for me, jazz came late in my life. Like bebop jazz was something that came way into my 20s. uh, the idea of composing for me really was like the thing that I always wanted to do. Listening to film music and all that, orchestral stuff. There was so I'll try to make it short. Then to coming here. So later, like as a teenager, like in my 16, 17 years old, I started to play outside of church, like getting into pop music and getting into Brazilian jazz, samba, funk, improvisation. Kind of trying to. Not a lot of teachers. I had some great teachers, but not many. It wasn't widely available. Resources were not available. We can talk about that later too. But then eventually it got serious in my 20s, and that's when I decided to attend college uh, to get a degree of all things, not in classical music because I didn't want, not in jazz because we didn't have, but one of the two main universities in Rio had just started a program in Brazilian popular music as a bachelor's of music degree, and that's what I want to do, with emphasis in arranging and composition. So that's what I did later in life, and then I was playing, and then had by then I was totally immersed in composing and doing all sorts of instrumental and popular music arranging. But my dream was, because jazz was always a thing, at that point growing in me, I really wanted to come to the US, but not for a bachelor's anymore. Now I wanted to really get the writing down. And also the resources you guys have in the US. I did not have a big band for me to write. I didn't have an orchestra for me to write whenever I wanted. So I was writing a lot of stuff for whatever group you have. It was always like this. Oh, let's do a shorter group and let's arrange. Yeah, what do we have? Two cellos, one tuba, one oboe, two flutes, and one saxophone. Yeah, sure, well, let's do it.
Now you mentioned I have many questions that I want to ask. An
Okay.
hour always flies, but you mentioned something, and I think you may be the first guest that we've been able to talk about this with. Can you talk a little bit? You mentioned for the people that don't know choro music.
Uh-huh.
Can you discuss that?
Yeah. So Brazil really, I mean, it's overwhelming how many music styles Brazil has. And I don't pretend to be an expert on all of them because Brazil's big. And, if you go to different areas, different cities across the country, wow, I didn't know about this. So that's why I wanted to get a degree in Brazilian popular music, which seems weird for a Brazilian to do, but no, I mean, as a Brazilian musician, right? And I learned a lot, no question about that. So there are the big cities in Brazil, I would say, back in the mid 20th century or beginning of the 20th century, Rio, São Paulo, those are the places where Rio especially was the capital of Brazil until the 1960s, 50s, 60s. So everything that happened in Rio became the official Brazilian music of the time. One of them was choro, which is a type of music that comes from a combination, if I can, say that in very easy terms, of all the European dances, mazurkas, polkas, all that stuff, with the African roots of Brazilian music. And that combination happened, just symbiotically, right? It's just
And
like musicians.
wasn't the time frame, and again, I'm
Mhm.
a beginner in knowing all of this stuff, but wasn't it's very similar, like shore music, to my limited understanding, is similar to jazz in the time frame that it happened and the growth of how it became part of like Brazilians, um, uh, their version of jazz, for lack of a better term. Is
Yeah, I
that a
think
fair assessment?
I would argue that it's even earlier. Shoto is earlier than that, because there was a lot of a lot of, again, the dances, and it's just hard to pinpoint when that, for example, if you had former slaves, servants, who did not have like musical education, right? They're not educated, but they can play. They're very good. And if they're playing a polka for the nobles to dance, there is a move that many historians say, well, it just they start to play the way they play, right? And then that thing becomes something else. And then eventually someone calls that something else something, right? There was a time when old choro was called Brazilian tango. That's like in the 1800s. So that was already. So it's hard to pinpoint when it started, but it's definitely earlier than ragtime in the U.S. But it's the same. I would say it's the same combination that ragtime has. You have some European things, but you have the African root kind of bouncing it more. So that became a style in the late 1800s where people composed and they would just get together, in the bars, or like for a party, a celebration, and just play together whatever instrument you had. No arrangements.
Yeah,
And
I'm gonna
uh,
stop you here, and I know this is incredibly rude because I want to talk about you. I just wanted for people, because I don't think in these interviews I don't think we've ever discussed churro before, and since you
mhm.
touched on it, I just wanted to give a brief like
Sure,
explanation for
sure,
people.
sure.
I want to discuss you.
Uh-huh.
So going back to before you came to the United States and before you went to college, so you're playing in church with your mother, and in the church you're learning lots of different types of styles of music. You're learning how to read, also
Mhm.
playing by ear.
Sure.
Were there, besides the adults and other folks in that church community, were there other outlets for you to play, other musicians that you could play with music outside of the church?
Uh, so okay, so we're talking my teens. We're talking the late 80s, and so jazz came to my life through jazz fusion. That was jazz for me. Jazz for me was Chicory Electric Band, Spiral Gyra, Yellow Jackets. That was jazz. So at church, a fascinating thing now that I think about it. All of us young musicians, so we study music very early. We go privately study. We don't study in college. We do stuff before. So
You mean private lessons,
private
or
lessons,
yeah?
yeah, or you can try a conservatory. I had a conservatory that I went to when I was 9. and then I took piano, but I also took a class in music theory. So they did the whole thing, different classes. So at church, I mean, a lot of the folks who played with me, we listened to the same stuff, the instrumental, and then we create our own groups to play. Sometimes even at church, sometimes the church would have an afternoon, hangout for musicians, and we would play instrumental music. Some churches had big bands, a few churches had. Uh, so that was pretty much the outlet. Was pretty much everything around the church, but different not services, but different events of the church in which we could play this or play that, or louder, quieter, and stuff like that. Funny thing to think about that, because really, if you're designing a music program, you don't think that, right? And I think that's really the problem with academia in general. You pick and choose. Are you gonna read, or are you gonna do this thing, right? So there was no academia there. It was just like do whatever, right? You're a pianist, right? And no one was pushing me to do it. It was really the hanging out of it. So I think that was the process.
Yeah, definitely. It's probably similar. If I think back with me learning how to play, there's the school band that you play in, and you have your education in that. But then you get together with your friends and you play music that you want to play. It becomes
Mhm.
a communal thing.
Yeah.
Besides just the you have to do this to get a grade.
Exactly. And interesting too. So if I'm then in my uh, 18, if I 18, 19, we are playing this instrumental thing informally. Then what happened after that with me, I started to get invited to play contemporary Christian music, but now for real, with like the people who were famous in Rio, recording. They played on the radio. That was a very big leap for me in terms of like really, okay, this is my profession, and that happens before I went to college to do music. But okay, we can do this, and then people start to, oh, you're a pianist and you arrange. Can you produce an album? So the first one I was 19 when I produced. Of course, I listen to that now. Yeah, well, not fantastic, but I think there's so much of like, okay, go do this. There's so much of that, and also the relaxed feel that you're not really competing with anyone. You're just like, oh, sure, I'll do it. There's kind of a naive feeling that, okay, I'll try, and I think that was very valuable in my life.
We're I'm curious in Brazil and growing up and playing economics of being a musician. Could you make
Mhm.
a decent living as a musician just playing, or how did that look? I mean, it seems to be the
Yeah.
same story everywhere in the world, but
Yeah. Well, it's definitely harder than here. There's no question about it. Because in general, I mean, who can, physicians in Brazil don't make as much money as physicians here. I mean, everything is very different. For me, I think that was another benefit of doing that whole thing when I did, until 21, 22, because I think I could, I wasn't rich at all. I was quite poor, but I could teach. I was teach. I started teaching at that conservatory where I was learning. I was 13 when they hired me to teach. It was a very funny thing because uh, they had students who wanted to learn chords, but it was a very traditional place. They said, "Well, you can play. You want to teach for us?" So I taught twice a week there, and then I had finished my piano course already by then. So I had that thing, and I had some private students, and I wasn't paid by the church. But then I started to play this, concerts here and there. I would say it wasn't enough to survive, to pay rent or anything like that, but I could because I was living with my mom until, you know. And then after that, I started to really teach full time music academies and all that. And then the next step after the Christian contemporary Christian famous people was to start college and then be invited by bossa nova players. Now we're playing nightclubs, I'm 22, 23 when that started. But I'll tell you, it's pretty tough for two reasons. One, because of economics. The second, because, I mean, as you'd expect, Brazil in places like Rio, I have a lot of good musicians in place. So it's the New York of Brazil. I mean,
I was
so
having this
it's all about
conversation.
contacts, connections.
Yeah, definitely. I was having this conversation with someone else. I can't remember if it was one of our guests or just one of my friends, but we were talking about the economics of being a musician when you're single, just
Uh,
supporting yourself and having to
right,
deal with that, which
right,
is a challenge. And
right.
then it's a totally different ballgame when you're supporting a family as a
Mhm.
musician. Well, now it's like you have to do this.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
serious
It is
business.
very hard. And Brazil doesn't have, I mean, we don't have a lot of universities, for example, music programs. there are two in Rio. Rio is a state with millions of people. I mean, Rio de Janeiro city has, I don't know, 8 million people, just the city, and there are two universities, and it's very competitive, very hard. So even the idea of, okay, I'm going to get a doctorate degree and teach college in Brazil, just where, which one? You have to wait for someone to retire to get that job. It's going to take a while. So it's very complicated. When I came here, my intention was really to learn. I didn't have the intention to stay here. I considered going elsewhere. I always considered leaving Brazil because of economics. But I really didn't think that this would be the place for me to stay. But I definitely wanted to come here because of resources and the jazz and the knowledge that is available here.
Well, now you mentioned you got into jazz. You said later in life in your early 20s, which is not super late. I mean, I from what I understand, like Wayne Shorter didn't start really like playing and studying till he was 15. So that'll be our shining standard. Of you don't have to be a 2-year-old prodigy to do this stuff. But so did you? Before you came to the United States, you started getting into jazz more. You said Chick Corea and fusion and that kind of stuff. So who were some of your favorite players aside from Chick that were maybe some folks that you look to, like, I like what they do and I kind of emulate or want to learn what they're doing? Were there like a...
Yeah, I don't know about emulating. That was always a thing that was interesting in my process. I still listen to a lot of instrumental Brazilian music. There's a pianist he lives in New Jersey for many decades now, called César Camargo Mariano. If you never heard the name, there's a famous Brazilian singer, Elis Regina. She sings with the Águas de Março, with Zobin. Famous. She was very famous. He was her producer. They were married back in the 70s, 80s. And he's a fantastic pianist, great composer, great arranger. He did film music, all that. I remember listening to him a lot. American musicians or like jazz musicians. I remember listening to Michel Camilo a lot. He's not American. Yeah, Michel Camilo was big in Brazil, and we were talking about this before. There was no internet, so I listened to a lot of Pat Metheny. Was very Lime Mayers was such an influence on me. And again, fusion, right? We're still talking fusion, and then how they crossed between the two things. Then I started to dig Chicoria, Light as a Feather, Spain. So Chicoria Electric Band came first, and then moved to that. The pianist with the oh, escaping me now. Bud Powell, there was one like in my between 17 and 18. I looked at him and I laughed it because for me the music was overwhelming. That was one of the first ones I came back to when like in my 20, 22, 24. Then I started to listen to Charlie Parker, and then some hard rock musicians. But I stuck with Egberto Gismondes, the Brazilian players more, because it seemed more. Because remember, I'm still in Brazil, playing in Brazil, right? If your question is still there. So at the end of the day, all I wanted to compose and play was that type of music because that's what was being asked of me. I wasn't. There weren't jazz gigs. There were gigs where you play Brazilian music and put a jazz standard in it. That was most of it for me.
We did this thing yesterday for the Tacoma Public Libraries. We were talking about music from around the world, and we had an hour.
Uh-huh.
That's nothing in terms of like. So we try to just barely touch on the surface of these different things. And what I was trying to explain in the demonstration is like, you could spend a lifetime on any one of these things. I mean, you could talk about Shora or bebop or any of these things for forever and still never get it all figured out. So it's massive. And I tell this to students all the time, like, the more you learn about music or any art form, really, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So you get this certain level of proficiency, and I think most serious musicians, you're always learning and growing. You're always a student for the rest of your life. Exactly. It's just you get a certain level of being comfortable, but then you realize, oh my gosh, I got to work on this, and I got to work on that, and it's unending.
Yeah, which I think is the reason why we do what we do. I don't know. I could be wrong about that, but I think what keeps musicians playing until they are like 90, dying on stage, it's yeah. Otherwise, I mean, what boring work it is that I think I got it. I think I got it figured out. No, now I need to look for something else. I mean, our idols are like that. Like you look at Wayne Shorter, for example. There's so many, right? That okay, you can't stop. Keep going. You just finish an opera. Is that right? I haven't heard that yet, but I'm curious about it. So I think that's what keeps us doing what we do. It's a wonderful thing. I love it. But yeah, so for me, I think the if I may, there's one thing that I think about my life as a student of music. Because my temperament always gets in the way. I'm an introvert. I love to teach. I mean, I'm a different person when I'm teaching. But for me, if I go back to the church where I learned, because the church didn't have musicians, and then if I go to the church where we played instrumental music for fun, and then if I go to the bossa nova thing because we're super cool and the events were nice and we had a good time, and if I go back to the jazz that I played, Brazilian jazz, the one thing that is constant there is the community. It's the music that is made for for yourself, of course, but for the group and for the community. It's always like for me, there's a sense of service in it. Really, really is. It's not like I'm not trying to be poetic here. It's really like wow, yeah. It and then the one thing in the beginning that I remember put me, kind of put off with jazz for me was like the bravado thing of jazz that I saw in some circles where like oh, this is like kind of a competition kind of thing. We're gonna and I saw that in Brazil too. Some of the places where people would actually do that was like this. Wait, but that's not fun. I mean, for me as a shy kid, trying to find himself, that was very hard for me. So I think that's part of what took me a while to get into.
Well, and the cool thing, I mean, you could look at all these contrasts, and really, it's like it's all a matter of taste. It's like telling someone, well, Japanese food is better than Italian food. It's whatever you like. I mean, you have Charlie Parker,
Right.
you've got Paul Desmond, or you've got Freddie Hubbard, and then you've got Chet Baker. They're totally different, or like Art Tatum and Ahmad Jamal. I mean,
Uh-huh.
totally different contrasts, but
Right.
all great in their own ways.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it's
Exactly.
it all depends. Like it's a tough one, and it's art. How can you say
And
this
it's
art is
art.
better than that
And
art?
it's art. Yeah, yeah, it's art. You're trying to really communicate, and you're trying to engage with people with your art. Be it the musicians on stage, or be it the people listening to you through a recording or in live. And you really, otherwise, I don't think there's much connection, right? It's just abstract, right? But if the moment they start to really like engage with you, and I've had moments like this that are really like remarkable and kept me going,
Well,
in my life.
speaking of you going, let's talk about you coming to the U.S. Now. When you made the decision to come to the U.S., you said you wanted to study and
Mhm.
resources, obviously. And I don't know how old are you?
I'm 45.
We're okay. We're roughly. I'm 43.
Hmm.
And so yeah, as what we were talking before this, the internet came in when I was in high school. So when
Hmm.
we were really hungry for like going out and getting stuff. So
Right.
resources was a big deal. So what made you decide to come to the United States, and where did you end up first? Where did you go first, and why?
Okay, before I answer this question, just one thing I should point out because I think I remembered something important. I had one phenomenal teacher when I was probably 17, 15 to 16 to 17. Uh, uh, there was a guy in Rio. He had his home academy, music academy. His name was Ian Guest, Hungarian, Brazilian. He taught everyone like Toninho Horta, the great Brazilian guitar player. He was his student. And then somehow, after I started high school, I met a lot of jazz folks there, and that's how I really started getting into jazz. And then they recommended this guy, so I studied 2.5 years just studying harmony with him. Phenomenal, phenomenal. I remember that because he just passed away this week. And he had such a big influence on me. He was a graduate from the university in Rio with a composition major, and from Berkeley with a uh, I don't know what major he had there. Uh, Probably from the late '60s or early '70s. Phenomenal, phenomenal guy, and I always remember him as like being the person who really made me want to write music, not necessarily perform, but really compose. So back to your question now. Coming to the U.S., your question was
When did you come to the U.S.,
uh-huh.
and what was you mentioned resources being one of their main
Mhm.
reasons? I'm assuming there must be more than that. And where did you go? Where did you go first, and why did you choose that
Sure,
location?
good. So I used to play for the last 3 years of my time in Rio. I was living in a very beautiful resort town. called Búzios. A lot of cruise ships coming in, every night. A lot of foreigners, a lot of artists. And I played. I was the house band in the house band for 3 nights, 4 nights, sometimes a week. Very very busy. And at that time, I was teaching there. There was a music academy there, just trying to save as much money as I could because I decided that I wanted to come to the U.S. But from there, internet by then was fine, was happening, uh, but it was still seemed very hard to audition to a university in the U.S. Just being in Brazil, send a tape, and the whole process wasn't great. That was 2008. I was looking for that, and of course, if you just Google it back then, it's just the same big universities show up all the time, University of Miami, all that. And I don't know, somehow the process seemed complicated. And one night, I was, as it happened several times, someone would, hey, I have my saxophone. Can I play with you? And then this guy came, a couple came, and then he was speaking Portuguese with a very strong accent, and his then girlfriend was Brazilian. And then he played great. It was great. I had just recorded an album there. He got the album. And then I asked him, hey, you're from the US, where do you live? Oh, I live in Oregon. Oh, you live in Oregon. Man, I'm looking for universities, blah, 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 blah. Do you know a lot of programs for masters? And then he didn't say much. He said, oh, there's so many universities there out there. And then, okay, great. So we talked a little bit. He left. A month later, he got our CD. He emailed us back, me and one of the band members, bass player, Wagner. And then he said, hey, folks, love your CD. It's great. Blah, 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 blah. Nice playing with you. Hey, by the way, I teach at university. And check out our website. Maybe, I don't know, you might want to check it. Because he also had a Brazilian group in as a class. And he was in Brazil also researching all of that. So I was very shocked. The guy never said anything that he was teaching. Anyway, both my friend and I applied for scholarships. And we got, both of us, full ride to Bulgaria Mass. So we came to the U.S., Wagner and I, in 2009 to start at Western Oregon University, which is near Salem, and that's where we started. And then after graduating 2 years later, they hired me to teach part time there, and I stayed for a few years.
And then so you started in Oregon, and then so from there, what happened? Because you're here in Tacoma now. So what was the?
Right.
That's many years, over 10 years now.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So there in 2009, that period there, of course, I started writing like crazy. Big band mainly, but I did some wind ensemble. I was just writing for anything that needed quartets, whatever. So there was great growth for me there. Then they hired me to teach. I taught there for 3 years. And then I met my wife there and then got married there. Then I started to realize that, okay, I love this. I'm doing what I wanted to do, teach college. And I'm writing a lot and have plenty of resources. Now I have the orchestra, I have the band, I can just sit down and write. But I realized that I wouldn't have that. I wouldn't have the possibility of doing that full time if I didn't have a doctorate degree. So I started looking for a doctorate degree, which was not an easy search because of my history, and that is very important, because some places are very jazz only places. Some places are nothing, no jazz at all. So I finally found a place after going there, talk to the person who would be my main teacher. I moved to Colorado to go to University of Northern Colorado, UNC. David Caffey was there, the teacher, and we had a nice conversation. I had a very frank conversation with him during auditions, saying, uh, do you guys care at all about this music? Because if you don't, I don't know if I'm gonna be here. Because I love jazz and I want to learn more, but I also want to make sure that I can keep doing the thing I do. It's gonna be a bunch of years to getting a doctorate here. So he was, as always, very kind, very nice, and then we had a wonderful time there. So I moved there. I did my whole thing there. Came back to Oregon, knowing that my wife's family was there, so we would have a place to stay for at least a couple months. And then Western Oregon hired me back, and then I got another job at a community college down south, Umpqua Community College. So that year was the year in which I started applying for jobs, and I got my job at PLU. So I just had 1 year back in Oregon, and then got the job here, and I started in 2018, which
right
was
before the pandemic.
right. It was I had 1.5 year of, yeah, it was cool, and then everything shut down. So I haven't been gone out very much here.
Well, I know this is kind of a loaded question, not in a bad way, but I'm curious because I know that we're very blessed in this area between Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia. There's some great Brazilian musicians. There's some great Cuban musicians and people that are either from there or have really studied and can play.
Mhm.
Now I know with you arriving right before the pandemic, and we talked about this before the interview, you haven't got a chance to really get out and play. And of course, like me, we both have young children at home, which
Mhm.
makes it very difficult.
Yeah.
Have you found being in Oregon and Colorado good musicians that can really play Brazilian music, or at least passable? Have you found that to be true, or is it difficult?
Yeah, I have. I have. It's a very good question. It wasn't easy, but that is something that I really learned here. That there are people really, really digging this music. It's fabulous and it's a beautiful thing to see. Uh, so when I was in Oregon, I recorded an album. My second year there, I recorded an album of songs, which also my compositional output says a lot about my history. You're gonna find instrumental jazzy stuff. You're gonna find Brazilian instrument. You're gonna find songs. You're gonna find orchestral big band stuff. So my first album here was an album of Brazilian songs. I wrote music and some of the lyrics. Uh, Phenomenal players. That album I recorded in Brazil, the rhythm section, brought back uh, on vacation there, came back. And not that I didn't find musicians here, but I was still, 2 years into the process. Then I started to meet the people who really like, oh man, I dig this music. They really started playing a lot. Moved to Colorado, and then at the university, I met Jim White, who is the drum set teacher there. He's a phenomenal full-time teacher there. And then I wrote a bunch of big band pieces, and I recorded the second album there. There's a bunch of Brazilian stuff, and he really, really can play. It was amazing. Then I came back now here, and of course I've been playing with Mark Ivester a lot. He can play that stuff so well. I know there are more, and I haven't met a lot of the Brazilian musicians or the people who really dig this music. In Oregon, I found a lot of people. I have a bunch of drummers that I know I can call anytime. So that's a beautiful thing for me to see. I was fully unaware of the communities in those places. I actually didn't know anything about the state of Oregon when I was in Brazil. I never heard of it. So that was for me. It was very surprising. So I want to meet more. So if you're a Brazilian musician watching now in the area and you want to play some Brazilian music, I'm around. Please.
We're almost getting to the point. I guess we can do this. Well, I'm going to wait till the end. We'll say how to get in touch with you and all that kind of stuff. But wonderful. Okay. So Tacoma, yeah, you've gone. We talked about this a little bit too. You went from Rio de Janeiro, the New York of Brazil, to
Did I just say that? I don't know.
yeah,
I
no,
said
no, no,
that.
I get it. People
Yeah.
understand.
Okay.
People understand. And then you were what was the town in Oregon? The first one that you went to? You said Salem, but there was
Yeah,
another.
it's Monmouth.
Monmouth,
Yeah,
okay,
it's
which
15
is a
miles
vast
west.
difference
Yeah,
from
yeah,
Rio. So was there a
yeah.
bit of like pace of life shock going from one to
Not
the
a
other?
bit. No, there was a lot. It was wild. Yeah, it was very difficult for me to get used to the weather. I haven't yet, but I appreciate it more now. I appreciate the beauty of it. It was a very big shock for me, but but it came in a time at a time in my life where I needed it. I really needed. Um, you talked about economics in Brazil. Brazil has been up and down, great moments, terrible moments, my entire life, and I had at a personal level had gone through some very 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 complicated things, very difficult experiences. So it was really a blessing to come to Oregon of all places. I really did not want to be anywhere else. And then the people I met there, I mean, oh my goodness, man! People just receive me in their houses. What do you need? How long do you want to stay? Let me go with you and open a bank account with you. For you. Let me help you. English. I mean, think about that, right? I mean, it's not. I mean, it's not easy to just go to a place and start living a different life and having to deal. I remember every class, especially getting a master's. We would have this complicated class where I was afraid of not understanding, the lectures, and then I would bring the river record and then take home and having to read 7 books in 10 weeks. It's just like amazing. So it was a big shock for me, but I think now I feel like it was needed, and it was just one more of the many times that I had to adapt to something new. I don't say that to it's not a self compliment. It's just like, well, I guess that's what it is. That's our life as musicians. You put yourself in that danger all the time.
Well, we talked about also too, and this is not like a getting older, get off my lawn type of thing, but you mentioned accessibility and having the resources. And when we were coming up, and we've mentioned this in other interviews too, but getting the information, getting albums, getting finding sheet music for things was a challenge. And now, like we mentioned, the internet came in. Like when I was a senior in high school, the internet came. We didn't get YouTube or Spotify, the rest of this kind of stuff, till much later. And so, going to another country and getting a master's degree and going above and beyond in another language, I mean, that's a lot of work. Where we were commiserating before the interview. We were talking about how students now, I mean, there's all of these things on the internet, both good and bad, that are just at the touch of a button. And I don't know if apathy is the best use of the word here, but definitely there are students that want to learn how to play and are hungry, but with all this stuff being there, many times it goes untouched or underutilized. I mean, care to weigh in on this?
Yeah, no, of course. And I honestly, to be fair to my students and to our students, I don't think it's their fault. I really think it's the world we built for them. It's I mean, we should know better about how much time we spend on our phones, and I could be right, I could be practicing. It should be because it's wow. For me, it's hard. Even though I have the memory of like not having anything to do and sitting down and just, "Oh, I'm gonna just play this thing." I have this memory, and for me, it's now, wow, yeah. Sometimes it's hard to do that. So I can imagine the young, my kids. It's how they're growing up. So it's really hard. So I try to say, in the most loving way, tell my students that you need to stick with something. You know, like you assign a solo, by Bill Evans, and then did you listen to it? Oh, I did. How many times? Once. Hmm. Did you listen to the saxophone solo coming up? Oh, no. Oh, you just listened to the solo, the piano solo? Yes, I did. No, it's a package of things that you should listen over and over because it goes away, right? I mean, but I don't think they're trained, And again, I say that with a loving heart. I think we have to help them be trained in the like chewing the information and chewing. I think the attention, it's very hard to keep it.
There's lots of things vying for attention
Yeah.
that we didn't have. I mean, there were other things, but it was different because now there's so many things. But this is a whole nother interview for, again, I want to talk about you. um, So we're getting to that point. If you have where we open things up for questions. So if you have any questions for Cassio or
This goes by
myself,
very fast. My
yeah, I
goodness.
know it always is too short. But if you have questions at this time, please put the questions in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to them. Are there any questions yet? No, not yet. Okay, I have a question for you. So growing up in Brazil and having that just being part of the day to day Brazilian music, which is huge, and there's so many things to discuss with that. If you have someone like myself who was born here, I'm half Iraqi and then half Irish, German, English. Brazilian music was not
Whoa.
in heavy rotation in our house. It just wasn't a thing later on in life. But if people wanted to learn more about that music, let's say they have no education at all or have no idea, this is the first they're even hearing about that, where would be some good resources for them to start learning how to play or groups to listen to? Where would you direct someone to say, here's a good place to start?
Well, first of all, listening a lot, and of course, as we said, there's a lot of resources out there. Let me point something out that will lead to my answer. The one fascinating thing about Brazilian music, I don't know how it was for you growing up here in terms of like listening. Jazz was always something you listened to on the radio, like a separate thing, or bought CDs. Aside from, you had all the specialized music, radio for jazz, radio for rock. Is that right? Okay, there was some of that in Brazil too, but because there wasn't officially jazz in Brazilian radio, right? Usually, you would have this pop radio station that would have an hour of jazz. That could be anything from fusion to anything else. Now, the music that jazz musicians the Brazilian music that jazz musicians really absorb. Wow, this is great. Rubin, it's whoever. Uh, that is the Brazilian popular music that we saw. I saw that on TV, like not specialized at all. Soap operas. I grew up with soap operas. It's a big thing in Latin America, and there would be like a Jobim song, a famous Jobim song there. Like, wow. So there is this interesting, I want to say contrast, but you find in Brazilian popular music a lot of the sophisticated harmonies, and people are singing like regular folks. People sing that stuff. I don't know how much of that exists here. We have Stevie Wonder, all that stuff, but I think it's still different. It's jazzier when you hear Jobim play his stuff. So because of that, there's a lot of resources for people to listen to. Singers who have composed, and their music have become has become jazz standards. I think that's one thing to think about. Um, what else in terms of resources? Go visit the musicians, the Brazilian musicians in the area who are playing that music. Um, I would say that styles that you should definitely be familiar with to get you started are the three main styles from Rio, which I kind of started talking about the history, but choro was instrumental, but then it became samba. Samba branched out into a lot of styles, types of samba, bossa nova, samba partido alto, just different singing. Bossa nova being one of them, but much later. So if you just like start listening to anything samba, there's so many. I guess I could also post some. I have some summaries of like composers, performers that I can post on the page if you want me to do that. Locally, we have so many great people. Jovino being one of the most uh, one of the honorary Brazilian Seattleites who everyone loves, me included. But yeah, listen to Brazilian pop music. Don't necessarily listen. I'm saying this because you don't have to look for Brazilian jazz necessarily. That's not a thing that exists there. It's been coined after it got to the U.S. and now we call that okay Brazilian jazz. But it's pretty much Brazilian music, pop music.
Cool, wonderful. Any questions yet? No questions yet. Okay, wonderful. So you went from Oregon to Tacoma, and now you've been in Tacoma.
Three years and 9 months to be
Yeah,
precise.
2019 and 2020 don't really technically count, I
Yeah,
guess.
I was here.
I mean, you were here, but I mean, you didn't really get
I
everything's
was at
closed.
home zooming.
Yeah. So, in relation to Monmouth, how do you find? I mean, in the time that you spent in Tacoma, in my mind, I would kind of see it being, it's not as big, obviously, as a place like New York. It's a little bit smaller than Seattle, but there's a lot going on. It's not like a small town. So, in your mind, musically, and what you've been able to see in the general area, how do you feel in terms of a musician and a composer and an educator? Do you feel like there's lots of opportunities to play and teach and perform more so than Rio or in Monmouth? I mean, how does that compare for
Yeah.
you?
Oh, you talking about Tacoma? Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's way more opportunities to play, to teach. I think there is a thirst for music, and I have a deep hope that the pandemic kind of helped boost it. I really think based on the my students and people I talk to, a lot of people seem tired. A lot of students seem tired after all this. Going back to school has been very tough. But at the same time, I feel like people, students, but also the audiences, I think they want music. They want to be back. They want to listen to it. I've heard so many great musicians here. It's really amazing. I mean, if I were to put a band together, big band together, wow, there'll be so many people could call. Even though I'm here for only like 3 years. So venues, I think there's a lot here, more than Rio. Uh, but again, it's hard to compare to Rio being such a big city with so many millions. Proportionally, I think that there's a lot of stuff happening here. Um, I don't know. I don't know the situation for media. I don't know. We talk about jazz in the U.S., radio stations. I know. We have some excellent resources here too. I don't know if that's enough. I hope that I have all my issues that I'm sure you do have too with all the streaming of the music, the people not getting CDs. But I don't know. I have this faith inside of me that the pandemic actually will help us. Will bring people back to like actually watching people. Let me tell you one thing that happened recently. We had at PLU the first jazz festival in March. We brought a fantastic trumpet player called Greg Gisbert. Came from Colorado, Denver to play with us, and there were probably 200 high school students there. We played a concert in the evening. It was fantastic. I was so proud of my band. They played so well, the PLU Jazz Ensemble. And then at noon, when the high school students were there, we played half a concert with Greg, and he answered questions. And I was in shock by how the high school students interacted with him for the Q&A, for the 40-minute Q&A. They were cheering, they were screaming, they were like, what is this, what is happening here? It was so phenomenal the way they were. uh, and I was talking to one of the directors saying, you know what, you tell your students to go on YouTube and watch, and that's valuable, and I do that all the time. But there's something about being in the room with the music that it's not the same, it's irreplaceable. And I think a lot of people realize that, or are realizing that we can get into that.
Which is a good conversation to have, because we're going to do a live concert here in just 2 hours in this very room at McMinimans, which is free in all ages.
They have time to come.
Yeah,
There's
you
plenty
have
of
time to get down
arrive.
here, and Cassio's written a bunch of music. I've written a bunch of music. You can see it right here in real time, or not. If you want to stay at home, you could do that too. So
Yeah.
what? But it's music is better live. Music is better live. We have questions. We do have questions. Okay. Yeah. So the question is, as a music student, did you feel that there was a difference in learning as a musician in Brazil versus the United States?
Yeah, that is a difficult question because I'm old. and,
Easy,
and
easy,
of course,
easy.
and of course the world was different, right? So I have to compare. You know, I'm a music student. I definitely am. I'm and life has proven that all the time, over and over, that I have to start over and relearn. Uh, there are things that are different. If I think about my students in college now, and when I was in college, the college system in Brazil is very different. As I said, we study music. If you want to go to college to study music, you have to be a musician in order to just pass the entrance exam. You have to do year training. There's dictation to start college. You don't like my program at college had 10 slots, five for the first semester, five to start the second semester. That's it. For Rio de Janeiro, like millions of people, you have to be one of the first five to get into the program. So I had a colleague, one of my classmates. He was the principal French horn player in the Brazilian Symphony Orchestra. I mean, what are you doing here? Well, I didn't get a degree. Now I need to get a degree. So the competition is very hard. So there's a lot of, I mean, no one goes to college to learn music theory, for example. It's a given. So it is different. I'm not saying it's better. I just feel like, wow, there's so much of pre, but it's not the knowledge of the theory is not the important thing for me. I think what it helped with my history is that I learned a lot of basic things at an early age. So there was much, also my discipline, the need to be studying, the time that I had a little more free to study. So I feel like a lot of our students, I mean, by the time they start to learn certain things, they're super busy. You know, they're matured in some ways, so it's a little harder. But it's possible, and many people have done it.
I think it's an interesting point. Along, echoing some of the things that you're saying about time and distractions, and now being a parent myself. I started teaching private lessons in 1996, so a while now. And it seems to me, and I don't know if this is better or worse, but parents are, when I first started teaching, like maybe the students were just taking music lessons and that was it. But now you have folks that are taking lessons, and then they've got sports throughout the year, and there's all these other things. Like their time is eaten up, whether that's good or bad, with things all of the time. They're always going somewhere, got to be somewhere, got to do something. They're always engaged. Number one, I feel like there's no time for just to relax and just to think and just play. Which, and again, I'm not a child psychologist. I don't have any answers. I'm just noticing the difference of, it seems like Now kids have way more things that they have to do all the time besides just looking at just like doing music and just like focusing on one thing and really getting into that. Maybe you can, and again, it was a different world, 30 years ago or whatnot. So
no, I agree with you. And also then the music, which I think is the thing supposed to be. No one is really learning. Oh, I'm going to put my kid in music because maybe he's going to be a professional, right? We're not thinking about that. I just wanted to learn music, right? But then because it's the way you said, it becomes one more task. Then there's no fun in that, right? So as a kid, I went to school. School wasn't full time. School, at least, I don't know how it is now in Brazil. For me growing up, I stayed in school for 4 hours, maybe five. That was it. So the rest of the time, I was home playing or studying, and I did two things as a little kid for me: learning English, basic level, very basic level. The book is on the table. So no, that's all. And then my mom decided to do music because of the church thing. That was all I did. So I did have plenty of time to go out, which I didn't do a lot because I'm an introvert, as I mentioned from the beginning. But I did some, lots, loved soccer, but never played professional, never played with a team. We just did, and that was it. So my time, really, music became a distraction and kind of a fun game for me early on. I think this had such an important value in my life. Now, I know other people have different experiences, but I agree with you. I think kids are pretty busy, and I don't know how good that is.
like I said, we're not professional psychiatrists at all. We're not trying to solve this problem. We're just looking at, like,
Yeah.
as we said, we're both in our mid 40s, and when we learned how to play, things were different, and we're still learning how to play. But yeah, we spend a lot of time on our phones. I'm sure if we looked at our phones and said, like, how much screen time are here, we would be appalled at what we saw. So
Well, but we're talking. I mean, we're not talking about raising kids. We're talking about art, right? I'm just that thing. I mean, maybe they can be busy with. I just feel like they need to have enough time, and the way young kids, the way they learn music should be really a pleasant, rewarding thing. It should be fun somehow.
I'm
It's not
sure
easy.
you get these questions. I get these questions all the time, like, well, what do you do with your kids with music? I'm like, nothing. I do nothing with. I mean, it's around. Like, if I sit down at the piano to work on something that I have to do for work, I'll have one child on one side and the other child on the other side, and they're banging away on stuff, and I'm trying to focus on something, and that's just the way it is. With my daughter, if they express, like, there's instruments around that they can just play,
Mhm,
right, and they can play along with something that they hear, or whatever.
mhm.
But it's not something that I force on them, because particularly, as for teaching for so long, I don't want them to feel like it's a have to, it's another task,
Right.
because then they start to resent it. I mean, you have small children. Is that
Yeah,
similar?
yeah,
Or?
that's similar. So what the one thing we do at home is we just really uh, tap on the table all the time. Drives mom crazy, but we do tac, 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 tac. I always come up with just because I am like that. I'm very annoying in that way, and they love it. So we all, and I see my 8-year-old starting to play what was just noise and ta 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 before becomes like a repetition of what I did. And I'm not saying anything. I'm not teaching anything. I'm just like, oh, interesting. I noticed that you kind of repeated my pattern there. I'm really trying to go easy on that. I taught him one song on the piano, but then he got involved with something else. I kind of stepped back. Let's just let's just put some music in there. Listen to a lot of music at home, but I'm not trying to push at this point. I'll let you know how it goes.
No, it's funny though, and I'm not. There's nothing wrong with it, but I think sometimes people just think because you're a musician that you're
Right.
going to that. Therefore,
Yeah.
it's like, nope, that's not going to be like that at all. So,
They
anyway.
assume they're gonna play piano. So my wife is a classical pianist. So I tell people we're done with pianists in this house. So let's see what happens. I don't know.
Well, wonderful. Any other questions so far? No questions. All right, cool. Well, we're at that time. This is actually wrapping up perfectly right on time. So, number one, thank you guys so much for joining us, everybody out there, either joining us in real time or after the fact. Again, we do this every single week. We do the interviews and the concerts, all of which are brand new original music and free and open to the public. So, thank you for joining us. Hope you see the value in it. Again, thank you to our sponsors. If you do see the value in this and want to keep it continuing and keep it going, please feel free to consider making a donation. You can do that via Venmo or PayPal or mailing an old-fashioned check, and all that information is at the beginning of this post. We're going to take a brief pause and then do a bunch of sight reading, a brand new original music here at McMinimans. It starts at 5 p.m., goes till 8 p.m. Let's see. So Cassio, thank you for being our guest today.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
Really, my pleasure.
If people want to find out more about what you're up to musically or compositions or education stuff, how can people get a hold of you? Where can they find
Best place would be CassioVianna.com. That's Cassio with double S and Vianna with double N. Don't know why, but that's the way it is. I joke seriously that I'm a composer who plays piano. I write classical music, mostly chamber music. I love doing that, and songs in jazz big band. Commissions, if you want a piece, Brazilian or otherwise, whatever it is, including the classical pieces, I usually put a lot of Brazilian content in it, just the way I hear things. So I think the best way is to just reach me on my website, CassioVianna.com. Hope to see you there.
Well, thanks so much for being our guest.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
you.
Hope to see you soon, and take care out there. See you later.
Bye.